All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us virtually here at Villanova for this great panel discussion on the topic of what is Black biblical studies between the university, community, and church. I'm Ethan Schwartz. I'm a member of the biblical studies faculty in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova, and I'm so grateful for the sponsorship of the Villanova Africana Studies program, which really made this event possible. And we'll have a chance after the panel concludes to hear from my colleague, Professor Vincent Lloyd, who serves as the director of the Africana Studies program. And in advance, a special thank you to Vincent for all the help in getting this event together really in a short amount of time. We started planning this just about a month ago, so it's really great to see how it came together and with such great panelists and such great attendance. So thank you all again for being here. We have the privilege today to hear from three accomplished scholars: Professor Kenneth Gua of Drew University, Professor Stacy Davis of St. Mary's College, and Professor Angela Parker of Mercer University. But before I say more about them in greater detail, I want to provide a little more context for this event. We selected this date, April 19th, because it worked for all of our panelists, but it has ended up coinciding with the conclusion of the trial for the police murder of George Floyd, as you all undoubtedly know. This coincidence is unsettling and yet also appropriate in certain ways because our subject today, the Bible, has been implicated in the societal response to Floyd's murder ever since the former president cleared a crowd of protesters in the Capitol in order to pose for a photo op with a Bible in front of a church. This spectacle of the Bible, the quintessential Western condemnation of idolatry, being violently wielded as an efficacious icon against human beings seeking justice, was simply too much for many of us to bear. Ever since that happened, many communities that regard the Bible as scripture have grappled anew with the role of the Bible in both systemic racism, in the negative side of things, and on the positive side of things in racial justice work. This has been the case here at Villanova as well. A couple months ago here, for instance, the Reverend Naomi Washington Leapart, who's a member of the faculty and part of the ministry here, gave a really well-attended talk on the Bible and the Black Lives Matter movement. Today's event seeks to build on the energy around such discussions, but with a somewhat more specific scope: academic biblical studies, that is, the critical study of the Bible from humanistic perspectives in the context of the university. Those of you here who are not members of this academic field might be surprised to learn that biblical studies has been undergoing its own conversation around race and racism in parallel to what's happening nationally. The reason why you might find this surprising if you're not part of this field is that Christian and Jewish lay people often think of biblical scholars as liberal, even outright heretically liberal, people who read the Bible as a humanly authored, imperfect text, just like any other, denying its divinity and authority. And if you assume that biblical studies is liberal in that sense, you might also reasonably assume that biblical studies would be more naturally aligned with progressive stances on questions of race, among other things, perhaps. Turns out, however, that biblical studies has its own issues here. To oversimplify a bit, biblical studies as it exists today was basically the creation of white European Protestant men who were trying to recover the real, authentic history of biblical texts, personalities, events, and institutions. What did Jesus himself really say? Were the Hebrews actually enslaved in Egypt? Who wrote Deuteronomy and when? That sort of thing. All of this falls under the broad umbrella of what we call historical criticism. And the basic criterion of historical criticism is that you're interested in what the Bible meant back then, not what it means today. Your own experience as a reader of the text is supposed to be irrelevant. This sounds pretty radical and anti-traditional, sure, if you're thinking about it from a traditional religious perspective. But in practice, it has had its own racist and patriarchal consequences, analogous to the problems in more stereotypically religious uses of the Bible. It has meant that scholarly readings of the Bible from non-male, non-white, and non-Christian perspectives have often been dismissed as less serious or less critical. Minoritized scholars who actively bring their own positionality to bear on the text have often been marginalized as doing something other than biblical studies in its ideal, most rigorous sense, at least. Contending with racism in biblical studies, therefore, has been about challenging that marginalization and dismissal. It's been about asking how scholars of color enrich the scholarly understanding of the Bible because, not in spite of, their positionality and perspective. So this afternoon, we're going to engage with this question by hearing how three accomplished Black biblical scholars understand a specifically Black or Africana approach to biblical studies in their own work. Within this obviously large topic, we'll focus especially on two more specific issues, although they are themselves quite expansive in their own ways. First, how does Black biblical studies configure a scholar's responsibility to a community outside of the academic and scholarly worlds? And second, how does Black biblical studies engage the religiously normative world of the church within the context of Christian higher education, specifically, something we're obviously interested in here at Villanova? We'll begin with remarks from each panelist individually, followed by a moderated discussion amongst the three panelists, and then an opportunity for audience Q&A. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor Kenneth Gua. Professor Ngwa is Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Drew University, and he's the author of a forthcoming monograph that offers an Africana reading of the Exodus, a work that I should mention I'm privileged to have actually gotten to read some early parts of in a workshop a few months ago. So we're really looking forward to that. No pressure. And anyway, Professor Ngwa, please, with that, start us off. Thank you so much for being here. So, and just as a reminder, we're going to take about 10 minutes per panelist for this first round.
Well, thank you, Ethan, and to everyone else. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today and to participate in this conversation around a topic that is very, very important to many of us who do work in biblical studies. And I believe that, as Ethan mentioned, there is a certain sense in which, the timing of this event is both sort of serious and the fact that we have to sort of constantly interrogate this question also tragic, that part of what we are grappling with is precisely a question about the ways in which those of us who spend time reading the biblical text and interpreting that biblical text can find our voices, our methods, and our approaches articulated and received in a way that does not always convey marginalization. So one of the things that, as Ethan mentioned, I have been working on is the story of the Exodus in the Bible, a story that is very familiar to many of us, both in the academic world, professional academic world, but also in the life of the church. It's a story that has been mobilized throughout history and across time and space to ask some important questions about the meaning of community, the way justice and liberation become a reality, whether we should focus on single heroes as the quintessential leaders that we need in order to create a just world, or whether it's better to anchor our work in community. I should mention that for myself, I tend to focus, to argue in this work that for liberation to be sustainable, it has to be anchored in community, and that while we should read that what the biblical story, particularly Exodus, is doing is giving us resources to work with to move away from sort of the single hero, ethno-nationalist individual leader that a lot of us have historically struggled with, either because of racism or colonialism or any of the other major forces that have brought about great suffering on the majority world. And so I just want to highlight a couple of things here. First, so when I think about the question, what is biblical, Black biblical studies? I think of it as intersectional work. And the reason I think of it as intersectional work is because I understand the work to be at the intersection of professional and what others, some might call sort of the ordinary readers of the Bible. This is terminology that has become more current, especially in Africana or African biblical hermeneutics. So is it possible for people who have not been trained in the Western modes of interpretation to interpret the biblical text in ways that are life affirming and enriching? The obvious answer to that question is yes, but the fact that we have to ask that question is precisely the reason why we talk about the challenges that are associated with Black or Africana biblical studies, meaning that we have to always explain why one is reading the way one is reading. There is not a presumption of credibility from the get-go. And that is part of the way in which I see Black or Africana biblical hermeneutics straddling that intersection between the established professional methods of interpretation and the other methods that are not Eurocentric on the one hand, but also within the communities themselves. When I read the biblical text as a trained biblical scholar, and I have a conversation with my mother or my aunt who did not go to seminary, what is it that makes my interpretation better? How do I know that my interpretation is better than hers? And that question cannot be taken for granted. The second point that I want to sort of lift up for consideration is another level of intersectional work in Black biblical studies is the ways in which the histories and the her stories, both written and oral, of people of African descent, and not just the context for doing good biblical studies, interpretation, but they are also a resource. Because a lot of times what happens is that when Black scholars read the text, then they have to sort of say, oh, people say, well, that is sort of contextualization. You're using the lived experience of Black people as a context for interpretation. And that is important. Context is important. But I think there is more to that. It is that it is a resource. Blackness as a resource for interpreting biblical text. Blackness as a resource for good biblical interpretation is part of what I think is happening when we talk about Black biblical studies. So it is not just about the context, it is also about the fact that Black history, Black culture, Black art, Black music, Black religious traditions are a resource for understanding and interpreting the biblical text. A third intersectional work that I see happening here is the relation between sort of Black institutions. So for example, churches and museums or entertainments, including sports, and nations like the nation state, these kinds of Black institution or Black-led institutions and social movements become again, part of the resource for understanding the work of liberation and equity. How does social movement, for example, inform the ways in which we read and understand biblical text? How does the Black church tradition inform the ways in which we read and understand the story of liberation and healing? And how does, Black excellence in the fields of medicine and science and sports and politics inform the ways in which you understand the work of liberation, equity, and justice in the world? So I think that is how I understand the work of Black biblical studies. And I find in this framing a lot of resource. There's lots of Black scholars who have done this work. Will Gaffney's done a lot of work around womanist midrash. Brian Blunt has done a lot of work around understanding the meaning line. Gerald West has done some work around the notion of the stolen Bible, how an imperial document becomes an icon in African and Africana biblical hermeneutics, and many others. But I end with this. So in the framing of the Africana Bible, the authors, the editors talk about biblical, Africana biblical hermeneutics as a form of interlocution. So it is not just exegesis, it's a kind of interlocution. And that interlocution is precisely what comes to define the rich complexity of Black biblical studies. Esau McCullough recently published a book, right? Reading While Black, African-American Interpretations as Experience in Hope. And it's a fascinating book because one of the things that he does there is raise the question how to read the Bible in the context of policing. What does the Bible have to say about policing, about Black anger and frustration with racism? So let me stop there as a way of putting on the table some considerations for our discussion. Once again, thank you all for this invitation.
Kenneth, thank you so much for starting us off with such rich thoughts. We will definitely have opportunity to come back to a lot of the ideas that you've presented for us. We're going to turn now to our second panelist, who is Professor Stacy Davis, Professor and Department Chair in Religious Studies at St. Mary's College. Professor Davis has written scholarly books doing comparative history of interpretation along a number of different comparative axes, Christian and Jewish, Black and Jewish, along with several other subjects. So Stacy, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. I'm going to take a slightly different approach, and I think it's in part because I teach undergraduates almost exclusively. And so when I think about what is Black Biblical Studies, I'm thinking about things that I do as a scholar, but I don't necessarily teach that. So I'm going to sort of put the scholarship in the middle, but I'm going to kind of put the teaching and the service at the end, because there's a sense in which to be a Black biblical scholar and to talk about Black biblical studies in an environment in which I am the only Black biblical scholar there means I have to broaden my range a little bit. And so for the record, I'm what's known as a rhetorical critic. So I study the language of the Bible and the ways in which the language functions. And I study specifically how the Bible has been used to harm those considered to be minorities. And I say considered because I'm really in love with the phrase people of the global majority right now. But for people who are of a different ethnic group or folks who are of a different sexual orientation, the Bible gets used as a weapon against them. So as someone who happens to be Black, I see my role as a Black biblical scholar in twofold. One, to own that history, that the Bible is not a neutral, objective document, that the Bible is not all sweetness and light. I study the dark side of things. I study, well, not maybe the dark side of things, but I study the not so pleasant side of things. And I think that the only way that you can really talk about the Bible as sacred is to own the parts of the Bible that might be sacred, but are really quite nasty, actually, that are genocidal, that are misogynistic, that are ethnocentric. But once I do that, I see the second part of my job is to use that knowledge to make life better for those who have been harmed by those readings, right? That once you can own those readings, then you can decide what to do with them. Do you need to consider these as sacred? Are there counter readings? What can you do for those for whom this text is sacred to put them in a position where this does not have to be harmful space? And so one way that I try to do that in my teaching, I teach half of my classes are Bible, but half of them are an introduction to religious studies. So in the intro course, what I try to focus on are both non-white and then non-traditional white voices. I'm at an institution that's about 80% Catholic, but there are many different ways to be Catholic. So I try to make sure they can read Jewish scholars and Muslim scholars and focus on things that they might not be used to seeing. When I'm teaching my Bible courses, I focus on Judaism and feminist theory. So I use Jewish scholars, I use feminist scholars. I'm also really in love with anthropology because I think the broad-based introduction to religion allows some of my more sectarian students to see a different point of view. From a scholarly perspective, though, I focus on my social location as an African-American feminist. So some of my most recent work is kind of dealing with the ethical implications or lack thereof in the Hebrew Bible and contemporary life. So I'm writing on violence in the prophets. I'm writing on race and intersectionality in the prophets. I'm writing on the demonization of Black protest, for example. So I'm putting it in conversation with Psalm 137. So when Professor Ngwa mentioned Esau Macaulay, he and I are gonna have words, but it's fine. Because there are ways in which African Americans are told to forgive and forgive and forgive and hope and hope and hope in ways that might not always work for us. But I'm also working on a project on sort of the anti-Judaism within the creation of modern biblical scholarship, specifically Bellhausen, because when I teach him, the first thing students notice is he doesn't like Jewish people. And yet our, for lack of a better word, our origin story does not deal with what is blatant anti-Judaism in that founding story. And to not talk about that, I think actually makes it hard for all minoritized scholars everywhere, because there is a sense in which folks become idols. And so to challenge that means that somehow you are not doing the work that other people are doing, or that somehow you are putting your position above the text. Well, the people who were basically interpreting the text were putting their own position in. Shatter objectivity, the myth, please. But I think one of the things that I will conclude with is that because I am at a Roman Catholic institution, and because there are so few people who look like me, I think you end up being an activist by default. And so in addition to working with the Black Student Union and the Latinx Student Union, where I've sort of found a niche is as an LGBTQ plus ally, because having that background in Hebrew Bible and in New Testament has made me a bit of a resource. So I actually, in another life, helped with the establishment of the Straight and Gay Alliance at St. Mary's. And I worked with local folks in a group called South Bend Equality that basically rewrote the Human Rights Ordinance to include sexual orientation and gender identity, so that if you got kicked out of your apartment because you happened not to be straight, you could actually file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission, because up until about 2013, you couldn't. And so by way of concluding and transitioning, I kind of see my job as a Black biblical scholar to use what I know about the Hebrew Bible to help those who don't fight against biases that are perpetrated against them in the name of religion. When we first started working with South Bend Equality, folks didn't want to talk about religion. They're like, no, 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 we're just going to go with the merits of the case. This is discrimination, we'll win. We got destroyed. And we got destroyed because people were bringing church folks from Indianapolis and from the Outer Banks of South Bend, and they were coming in and saying, this is wrong because the Bible says so. So when we lost the first round, I said, I hate to tell you this. I said, but we're going to have to play on their terms. And it's not going to be enough to simply say, this is a wrong thing. We're going to have to, for lack of a better phrase, engage in a proof texting war. And so I hate to think of the Bible in those terms, but if you're going to use the Bible as a weapon to harm people, then my job is to kind of flip that script a little bit and say, no, actually, that's not what it says. And here's why that's not what it says. We lost the second round, but we won the third. But it took a combination of appealing to people's sense of fairness, but also, for lack of a better phrase, having to quiet some of the church voices that were screaming, this is a bad thing. And so it's not always a fun thing to do, but I think it's a necessary one. I think it's part of my job. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I really appreciate the angle of how teaching and pedagogy factor into this. And I'm also, your remarks got me thinking about potential connections between the scholarly methodology of rhetorical criticism and thinking about the public role of the Bible as a rhetorical tool, which like the overlap between the sort of the scholarly methodology and the actual way it's deployed. I mean, it seems obvious in retrospect, but I never thought about that that together in those terms. That's really interesting. Thank you. All right, so we will turn now to our third panelist, and from two Hebrew Bible / Old Testament scholars now to a New Testament specialist, Professor Angela N. Parker, who's assistant professor of New Testament and Greek at the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. Professor Parker has two forthcoming monographs. One is on Black Lives Matter and biblical authority, and the other offers a womanist study of the Gospel of Mark. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate the organizers for putting forth this time together to have this conversation. Thank you to Villanova for allowing us to be together in this Zoom space. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues who have gone before me and offered such rich beginning thoughts on our conversation today. So first of all, I think I want to begin to ground us by thinking about all readings of the biblical text are interested and subjective, even they do not admit it. All readings of the biblical text are interested, even when it Senate or white mainstream readings. Says my internet connection is unstable. Get stable. I want to show how these interested readings become dominant by showing a picture that begins to hopefully help frame our discussion. Oh, sorry. So I should have said, can I share a picture? Doesn't matter. I would say this: Google John Gast's American Progress. In the picture, American Progress, you begin to see that, there it is, thank you. You begin to see that the spirit of the frontier led the first American settlers. The spirit of the frontier signifies the person of Columbia, who's blonde white lady, of course, in white garments. She's bringing the telegraph. She's basically leading white settlers. And in the darkness, you can begin to see the natives, the indigenous folks who are running away and kind of being the recipients of, or going out into the darkness, because of course, Manifest Destiny and American Progress is about bringing lightness to dark areas, all right? It's about bringing lightness to dark areas. And when I was first looking at this picture, I was thinking she had a Bible in her hands, but she doesn't. She has a school book in her hands. So she has the idea of education coming to natives and bringing Western ideals, Western understandings across the entirety of these United States of America. So I just want to say, and at least ground us in the idea that a lot of our understandings in biblical scholarship comes from this Eurocentric and also American understanding of who we are as a people. So being said, when you think about such texts, and I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar, my colleagues are, but just thinking about the book of Joshua and how the book of Joshua allowed white folks to identify as Israelite and the indigenous folks to basically identify as other, or identifying indigenous folks as other. So when I think about Black biblical scholarship, I think about that first wave of Black biblical scholars such as Charles B. Kofor or Kane Hope Felder, who began publishing around 1991 and were advocating for seeing Black folks in the biblical text, because that white imagination, of course, only saw white folks within the biblical text. And I think that that's one way that Black biblical scholarship began to argue against even what we see in our biblical text. And then later on, that allows me to argue in my own work, if God still breathes, why can't I? That most schools still attempt to train all biblical scholars as white male biblical scholars with objective views of the text. So one of the things that I remember from my own master's program was, those days when I would ask the quote unquote wrong question uh, that was related to my own particular Black woman's experience. So I would argue that a lot of our early trainings in biblical scholarship began to squash the questions that we had that were related to our own identities, our own particular experiences. And so we still see ways that white supremacist thought invades our overall thinking today. And so thinking about the white settlers, thinking about Eurocentric ideals, and now thinking about American manifest destiny, we still see and are still fighting against attempts of America First, such as coming from Marjorie Taylor Greene, where you attempt to highlight an American First caucus that actually argues that European ways and understanding are classically beautiful. They are sources of freedom, that the Romans demonstrated the beauty and the functionality that we as American folks should begin to emulate, that there is still a belief that Eurocentric thoughts and worldviews are the highest thoughts and worldviews. So someone like me who comes along and teaches in my particular context about alternative histories, or even thinking about how perhaps Pythagoras actually learned geometry and trigonometry from the Egyptians who made the pyramids and actually figured out trigonometry and geometry. And then it gets back to Greece. Greece did not necessarily discover trigonometry and geometry, but they took hold of it and made it as their own. That becomes problematic when I especially read biblical text in this way, that looks at these alternative ideas that we have within our biblical text, such as what Gay Byron did with thinking through the Aksumite empire, that the Roman Empire was not the only empire at the time. So for my own work in biblical studies as a New Testament scholar, I have to think about the other empires that we generally don't think about in our New Testament studies. So how does all this play into why Black biblical studies matters? I would argue that Black biblical studies still matters because even after the first generation of Black biblical scholars began to uncover race and ethnicity within the biblical text, white scholars still don't read our work. White scholars still put forth the idea of Black biblical scholarship as lacking, as I believe, Kenneth was talking about, and even Stacy were talking about how they think about our scholarship as less than, or not necessarily scholarly or the standard. So white scholars are not reading us, and part of what we have to do is continue to make the correctives to white scholarship's objective readings of biblical text. So Black biblical scholarship asks the questions that others may not necessarily ask, which for my context particularly allows me to think about the issues of authority, inerrancy, and infallibility. In my tenure as a professor, I've often witnessed African-American students upholding an unshakable faith in biblical infallibility that I argue actually borders on white supremacy. So I've also observed that students, particularly even from the Bible Belt, often do not think critically about their own liberation and are oftentimes complicit in promoting the same conservative attitudes that border on white supremacist authoritarianism. That's a term that I'm coining in my own work, that I'm trying to begin to think about authority as different from authoritarianism. And so in my work, I examine inerrancy and infallibility as tools of white supremacist authoritarianism that limits humans' capacity to fully experience God's breath in the biblical text. Inerrancy and infallibility become doctrines of protection that actually serve as borders that keep some people out of even the conversation. So for me, as a womanist scholar teaching in a Baptist institution, a Baptist seminary that still teaches and preaches the gospel message of Jesus as the Christ, while recognizing that sometimes the God-breathed authority of scripture gets lost within a white supremacist authoritarian framework, I have to do two things. I have to hold a high view of the biblical text for faith reasons, while still pushing and allowing students to the ability to ask hard questions of the text. And so someone like Reverend William Lamar preached yesterday at St. Paul's Baptist Church in Philadelphia. And he preached on the Gospel of Luke and Jesus, the boy Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, who's answering and asking questions in the synagogue. And because it was HBCU day, Reverend Dr. Lamar likened the HBCU to the place where Black folks could go and ask and answer questions that others would not allow. So I think that the gist of Black biblical scholarship in the context of white evangelicalism and in the context of predominantly white institutions serves as the corrective to Eurocentric biblical interpretation that is entrenched in white supremacist thought. So now, that allows me to then begin to think about the difference between individual and communal engagement and what I see in churches. I think that there's still much work that Black biblical scholarship can accomplish in church settings, because specifically, I think about three things. We still, especially in church settings, talk about the idea of personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And so one thing that I do with students, especially as I teach Greek, is I say to students, you all have to become Southern. You all need to begin to say y'all and not just you. What am I getting at? Oftentimes in our church context, our parishioners are reading biblical text and thinking that the text is speaking to me and me alone. They don't necessarily realize that something like Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says, I beseech you all, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies, your collective bodies, as a living singular sacrifice. So I would argue that oftentimes we highlight the individual and don't necessarily highlight the communal as much as we should as we're reading biblical text. And I think that Black biblical scholarship, because a lot of us have grown up in what it means to be community. I'm a womanist. So if I'm walking to Canada, I'm not walking to Canada by myself. I'm taking mommy, auntie, brother, sister, uncle, everybody, because it is about that community engagement. And so kind of breaking down that individual versus communal becomes important. But I would also argue that, as Stacy began to put forth, part of Black biblical scholarship highlights how our predecessors in German scholarship tried to make figures like Paul and Jesus become white. I usually have a lecture that says how Paul and Jesus became white. And in that lecture, I can get to the roots of anti-Semitism within early German biblical scholarship, and then begin to talk about these ideas of race and ethnicity and what it still means for us today as certain scholars begin to otherize other people. And then third, I still have to deal with the idea of women not being allowed to preach and teach in churches. And so one of my dilemmas has been, how do I join a church that would not value my education or perhaps may be intimidated by my education? I don't live in a complementarian world, so I can't adhere to some kind of ideology like that. I think that Black biblical scholarship has to address some of those issues, even in our communal settings. So with all that said, in my work, I play with God breathing still today, so that we can realize that white supremacy has sucked the breath out of living interpretations of the biblical text, just as white supremacy still seeks to suck the breath out of Black and brown bodies today. And I think that, just as Kenneth argued that the idea of interlocution is important, I think for me, the language I would use is dialogical. How do we have these conversations back and forth where we can look at these hard conversations, stay in the game, and become mutually encouraged by one another? Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much. there's so many points that I could pick up on there to really effectively lead us into some discussion. I was really happy to hear that you talked a little bit about the inadequacies in your training from the you phrased it very nicely in terms of you were basically trained to be a white male biblical scholar. And so I wanted to actually begin, and as we move into this discussion component, to hear from all three of our panelists about the relationship between your academic training and the work that you are doing as a Black biblical scholar right now. So Angela spoke a little bit about the methodological and hermeneutical inadequacies there, and if that's the whole picture, are there complications there in terms of how good parts and bad parts interacted? And in terms of the inadequacies, what would you as a Black biblical scholar like to see happen in terms of biblical studies graduate training going forward? I mean, we can surmise from what Angela said that reading Black biblical scholarship as part of the scholarly canon would probably be a good place to start. But beyond that, I'd be really curious to hear about sort of where you think there are preliminary directions we could go towards fixing graduate training and in biblical scholarship from your perspective. So I mean, Angela, since you started off on this topic, if you want to just take it away, or anyone would be great here. So thank you.
Well, I think one thing I would highlight is to make sure that you pay attention to who you study with, because thinking about my master's program and how I started my first PhD would have been a PhD under a white woman who would have tried to still instill in me white feminism. And I then had to transfer to a Korean New Testament scholar who allowed my own womanist identity to shine through. So it really is about how you can position yourself within the educational field to get what you need as a budding scholar. And that's hard, because think about it. Like Will Gaffney has the ability to train PhDs in Hebrew Bible, but where are the places that budding scholars can go to receive a PhD in New Testament under a womanist New Testament scholar? So again, there's still that gatekeeping in those PhD granting institutions where it's still difficult. So it's going to be problematic until we actually get others in those positions to be able to do that.
Piggybacking off of Angela, I was thinking just how lucky I got, because I was too stupid to know any better. I think I'm the oldest person on this panel. And so I didn't realize when I went to graduate school, I was the first Black student that my program had. But I was also the advisee of their first Black professor, who happened to be in Hebrew Bible. I had 2 Jewish professors. And so when I decided, oh, I'd like to do my dissertation on anti-Jewish and anti-Black readings of Genesis 9, well, the one Black person, the 2 Jewish people were like, yeah, we good. And so, but it wasn't until I went to do my proposal that I had my director of graduate studies tell me, you won't get a job with this dissertation. And so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. But these 3 folks who have jobs said I could do it. You don't know what you don't know. And so I got lucky in that they had faith in me. And they let me do my own thing. Like I audited a class on feminist theory. I audited a class on sociology of religion. There were things I wanted to know. So I didn't just take my Bible classes, and I accidentally had support. But when I look at some of the people who are coming behind me and some of the struggles, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I had my share, but I didn't have it within that particular circle, because those 3 people were like, we've got you. There's no substitute for having senior scholars who will protect you and say, no, you will be okay. And even though I don't teach graduate students, I shout out to everyone who does, because we do need more folks in those positions. Or who knows, that director of graduate studies could have terrified me to the point where I wouldn't have done what I did.
Yeah, so in some ways I was also lucky, like Stacy, because I mean my dissertation advisor, Professor Leon Xiao, I remember the first class I had with him, and right after class, we were reading the book of Proverbs. We were talking about Proverbs, and I kept talking about oral traditions, and so he invited me to have a conversation with him after class, and then encouraged me to do a PhD program, and ended up being my dissertation advisor. So what happened is that even though there were limitations, we negotiated to where my dissertation included some aspect of reception history. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to talk about rabbinic interpretations. So the four senses of scripture, to other ways of reading biblical texts that did not immediately sort of succumb to sort of the modern European Enlightenment epistemologies. And so that sort of helped me in that moment. I recognized very much that that was not enough. But and so the part of the challenge that we have is that we have these instances where institutions that are well-funded do not want to do this work. They are not willing to commit the resources necessary to alter the paradigm. And so there is a certain sense in which it becomes for me slightly frustrating, because I wonder whether it is just about protecting what is already there. Is it part of sort of the ways in which the fragility of white supremacy sort of manifests itself in these institutional spaces, or is it what someone has called sort of the white incredulity? They just cannot believe that you are that good, and so they sort of cannot believe it, and so they're not wanting to resource it. And so part of what has to happen is to shift sort of the educational component of this, is to continue to push the case for these other methods of interpretation. I should mention, the JBL did allow sort of specific forums where you would have these analysis, about Black biblical scholarship, African biblical scholarship, African biblical scholarship, and they held the summit, the webinar over this summer. SBL did. The problem is that those are too few and far between. They happen and then it takes a long time again, and it always has to take some major tragedy for that kind of thing to happen, and that is part of the challenge.
So all three of you in the course of engaging with that question mentioned how your doctoral mentorship involved scholars from minority perspectives outside of Black biblical scholarship. We heard from Kenneth and Angela about Asian scholars, and from Stacy about Jewish scholars. So that actually provides a perfect segue to another question I wanted to get to, which is, do you see a specific role for engagement with other forms of minoritized criticism within Black biblical studies, over and above just a sense that it is something that you do, or it's something that you should do? Do you have a sort of a specific Black biblical studies vision of what it means to engage with that kind of scholarship? Not Black biblical studies, but yes, within various kinds of minoritized perspectives.
I think definitely. I think that there's definitely that collaboration and crossover that has to occur with other minoritized scholarship, with other minoritized scholars. That even I'm thinking about this book, Minoritized Women Reading Race and Ethnicity, that it's a book edited by Mitzi Smith and Jen Young Choi. So you have African-American and Korean scholars coming together. And so this book actually talks about how that works and what do those conversations look like? I think the importance of those conversations shows that you have both similarities and differences. And so you come together and you talk about your similarities, and then you even let your differences shine through, so that you can begin to read and interpret text in different ways that actually opens up interpretation for larger groups of people. It's not just for me. It's not just for Black community. It's for the entirety of the world. And I also would say that when we think about our white scholar friends, I have good white scholar friends who recognize that there's even that deficiency within their own scholarship because they don't ask certain questions. Now, again, not every white scholar is going to say that, but there are some who are beginning to say that now, because if you do something for 30 years and you've never asked certain questions, and you see others coming around now who are asking different questions than you, of course you're going to realize, perhaps I should have expanded my questions a little bit more. And so I think that the conversations and collaborations actually open up for a wider range of scholarship.
Yes, yes, indeed, indeed, Angela. So the point that you made about the community as a multiple is what I think can be resource for the kinds of research methodologies that basically decenter Eurocentrism and provincialize Europe pretty much. Basically, the idea is that, you know, this kind of epistemological probing that says multiplicity is the starting point for the ways in which we might understand biblical text, grounds the research agenda, grounds teaching methodologies in ways that I find would be more sort of justice oriented, and I would argue closer to the ways in which ancient rabbinic traditions sort of develop. Right, it was always this expansive, imaginative way of thinking about text and how they flow, how they move, and paying attention to the ways in which the meaning was not located inside the one text that one needed specific skills to retrieve, but was that you always lived in these multiple localities. And so for me, that's what I find particularly useful as a way of theorizing what Africana or Black biblical criticism is. It is that it is theorizing multiplicity and wanting to anchor that as a foundational space, as a beginning space for inquiry into how the Bible can live in these multiple spaces, how people can take it and turn it around, or through lament, or through praise, or through protest, or whatever, people can claim that ownership of the text beyond the professional individual.
Well, even to piggyback on both of you, even to rethink what we call minoritized criticism, right? Because it somehow suggests that it is outside of what biblical scholars are doing. Whereas as someone who was trained as a historian, historians have known since 1962, there's no such thing as objectivity. So, you know, we're really not the minority to some extent. The Eurocentrics are.
Yeah.
And so for me, I mean, I could not do what I do without the work of Jewish scholars like Boyarin and Amy Jo Levine and, you know, Tamar Kamiankowski. To have that framework and to be able to engage with that scholarship has been critical. And I'm a theory junkie, feminist theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory. To me, all of it fits within Black biblical studies, because what it all has in common is, how do you read differently, right? How do groups who have not been invited to the table read? And so I try to expose my students and myself to as much of that as possible, because if I want them to see themselves as Bible scholars, as people who are qualified to read, then I have to show them as many different ways of reading as possible. There is no one way to read. And so I feel that as an African-American scholar, quite frankly, we're all always reading. It's why I've got bifocals. Like, you're always wanting to know, well, who did this or who did that? And I don't want to limit myself. Like, anthropology and sociology of religion have been crucial to how I think about the Bible as a contextual document. So it's like, the more theory, the better.
I think it's interesting though, because in the Southern Baptist world, you know, critical race theory is getting that, oh, and so every class now I'm like, okay, so here's some of the theory, here's feminist theory, here's masculine studies, here, you know, just all of that, just to, woo. Yeah, I love it, Stacy.
Okay, great. I have a ton more I would love to ask, but I want to make sure that we have time for some audience participation here as well. So I'd like to open this up to questions from everyone in attendance. And if you could just, I'm happy to have you speak your question. No need to use the chat unless you would prefer that. But if you would please just use the raise hand feature, just so we can try to keep this somewhat organized. And just in the we've got about 15 minutes. We want to make sure to give Vincent a couple minutes for some conclusion. So in the interest of time, if you could just make sure your question is a question and keep it keep it as concise as possible, that would be great. So so please, anyone who would like to ask, please go ahead, raise your hand, and we'll call on you here. Yeah, Eric, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good doctors, thank you so much for your presentations. Would you please lean in a little further into the analytics and the methods and the praxis? We're talking about being theory junkies, but I mean, can we talk some more about beyond identity? Right? How does intersectionality as a theory, as a critique, as an analysis, how does Africana theory, how does womanist ethics and praxis inform what it is to do Black biblical interpretation? Because skin folk ain't kinfolk.
That is so true, Eric. It's good to see you. It's good to see you, friend. I think one thing that I like to do is when I talk about asking questions that I was not allowed to ask in seminary, part of the question formulation comes from how would an enslaved woman in Roman imperial time hear Paul's letter? And so I think that going to classics and also going to anthropology and going to intersectionality to think about the gender and the ethnicity of that person who may be hearing Paul's letter allows me to ask those questions. So I have to kind of go through the various categories and theoretical framework in order to say, and this is why my question is important, because others who have read in the history of interpretation, when they interpret Paul, they have not thought about the intersectionality of an enslaved Roman imperial woman and how she may have heard Paul, or how a freed woman would have heard Paul. So I think that breaking down those theoretical frameworks then allows me to say, and this is how I'm going to ask the question of this text, and then ask a question that allows me to interpret slightly differently than the history of interpretation has done. That's my way of beginning to do that. Yeah.
And I think to piggyback on Angela, because I am a rhetorical critic, I study history of interpretation. So I study racist interpretations for the most part. So I'm kind of laying the foundation that Angela's gonna deconstruct, thank heaven. But one of the reasons that I say that I'm a theory junkie is because to even ask the question, for example, why was Southern interpretation of the Bible so persuasive in the 19th century, means I have to take those words seriously, right? I can't just say it's a bad reading, and I can't simply just say that the slaves had it right. It's a question of who gets to persuade and why. So to answer your question about intersectionality, I think where it comes in for me, in addition to sort of race and gender and class, is issues of power. Who's able to publish? Who was able to get their words out? Because even in African-American churches, the women were not always able to speak, even though they had the same calling, right? And they said we had the same calling. But who gets published, right? Who gets invited to preach? And so I think a lot about power. As I tell my students, the person who can interpret owns everything. The person who can publish this owns the discourse. So who gets to decide what the Bible means and why? And so as a historian, that's where I have a tendency to land. But when I do things that are a bit more contemporary, it's still the same question. Who gets to interpret the text and why? And that's a question really about class. And back to Angela's point about authority.
Kenneth, did you want to weigh in here at all?
Yes, yes. So I can just make a comment there. Hey, Eric, good to see you. Like you said, I mean, part of the importance of intersectionality for me is important because within the category Black, you have so much variety and diversity, right? So within that category, it is always important to do the deep tissue analysis that sort of constitute part of what we've come to know as Black. So part of the way that I think about it is that if you take the metaphor, if you take the image of the slave castle, you have people from multiple ethnic, linguistic, religious groups captured and then chained into a singular Black. So that the production of Blackness is the wrestling of this complex diversity into a singular thing. And so intersectionality allows for a deconstructing of that colonial ideology that reduces the complexity of Blackness to a singular thing, and the ways in which that singular manifestation then travels around the world in the forms of sort of transatlantic slavery, in the ways in which you think about the one drop blood rule, like that is part of the way that kind of wrestling away of multiplicity happens, and intersectionality dismantles that.
Great, thank you. We got a hand up here. Yeah, go for it.
I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Yeah. Thank you for the affirmation. And thank you for that comment, Kenneth, because I think it speaks a little to the question that I wanted to ask, because I wanted to ask a little bit about what I call the midrashic nature of Blackness, which is kind of what is underpinning the question, what is Black biblical studies? It's the sense that Blackness does have this multiplicity that you're referring to, Kenneth, but it also has what I call the Sidney Poitier problem, that like when we talk about like our mentors or even senior scholars, everybody's got that Black person in their back pocket. All right, it's Renita Weems, Vincent Wimbush, right? Where I'm so tired of explaining that I'm not that kind of Black. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about how we approach the overdetermination of Black misrecognition to some extent. Is that like, I mean, there is a misrecognition in scholarship of the diversity of Blackness, yet Blackness has been overdetermined in certain ways through tokenizing and that sort of stuff. And I'm just interested in more in how you approach that in your own scholarship. And even what I would think of as an epistemological gap, I find that as an immigrant Black person, I have to spend so much time explaining being African before I can even enter into biblical studies. So I'm interested in how you approach that in your scholarship, how you navigate that balance of how much is this just me explaining to white people or other non-Black readers that there is this type of Black person that exists in this person of the world that you wouldn't dare enter unless you were colonizing it. But at the same time, trying to like take my own scholarship seriously, which is so much more than my own Black identity, but also then what is my individual intellectual capacity.
What you said.
Yeah, I'm just interested in like how you never. It's a very selfish question. It is, but like, how do you navigate that in your own scholarship or even in your own teaching, right? Because there's this sense that like there's a field tour aspect of it, and it's interesting to like wow them, yet at the same time, like how do we lend the authority that you would talk about, Angela, to Blackness without entering into that dangerous authoritarian space that we've been trained to enter in order to be legitimate?
There are two things that stood out to me when I was listening to your question. One is the Black Lives Matter mission statement, right? That talks about so many different ways to be Black, right? We are trans, we are straight, we are churchgoers, we are not. That one way to avoid tokenism is just to remember there are all different types of Black folks. I mean, one of the reasons that the civil rights movement ended up in such a hot mess is by not recognizing there was a gay man that dealt with the March on Washington. The Black Panthers ended up being just as patriarchal as the white folks they were trying to defeat. And so what I love about the BLM statement is it says, there are so many different ways to be Black. Whatever yours is, we support you, go and do your thing. But the other person that kept popping into my head when you were talking was Susanna Heschel, of all folks, because she is an amazing Jewish scholar, and she deals with sort of 19th century and 20th century racism. But she argues in one of her essays that that essay that's dealing with racism is just as much a feminist text as anything else. In other words, you don't get to pigeonhole my scholarship. That to talk about racism is to talk about gender, to talk about gender is to talk about class, to talk about class is talk about religion. And it's just a brilliant move because she says, yes, I do all this wonderful work on history, but I'm also a feminist scholar and this is a feminist project, fight me. And so, you know, define your own scholarship, that we are trained broadly, right? So we have the luxury of being able to do almost whatever we want with that knowledge. Those folks who were trying to make us Eurocentric, there's a reason they want slaves to read, right? Because once you figure out how to do this, Mary Daly talks about studied unlearning, that you can take what you've learned, like Professor Parker is doing, and turn it into ways that the folks who originally trained you could never have imagined.
Agreed. And Minnie, thank you so much for that. I mean, because you can only name who you are yourself, and you can't allow others to continue to name you. So some folks will probably want to say, I'm this or I'm that, but I just have to continue to name myself and also name my influencers. So there are many people who influenced me, and they do come from Korea. They come from Botswana. They come from the south of, you know, America, south of, you know, the southern states of America. And so they come from so many different places, and just naming that and recognizing it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up here. So we got a hand up. I'll ask you to go ahead.
Yeah, I had a quick question. Thanks to all the good doctors. One of the things that's frustrating for me in my work is when I read a theologian that's competent, but, you know, sort of vanilla, like a J.I. Packer and Alistair McGrath, where their take on, you know, Black theology or Black power theology is sort of that, you know, it's biased, or its interest is sort of a deficit. So this kind of connects to all the speakers, but especially Dr. Angela. Do you have a lot of hope for, a lot of optimism about the, you know, the prospects of dialoguing with white theologians who don't see the need to recalibrate their reading of biblical texts to sort of account for, you know, their whiteness or their, you know, hegemonic perspectives, their Eurocentricity?
That's such a great question. I was reading something by Alistair McGrath not too long ago, and was just basically saying something like he didn't get Black theology. And there was something, so how am I going to talk about this particular, his particular argumentation in a particular text that I was writing? And I think that there is hope for those people that I can talk to. Those people that are just not even worth me dialoguing with, I just don't do it. I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, but those who can actually enter into dialogue with the idea that perhaps they don't know everything, those are the folks that I can talk to. And believe me, I'm finding that there are some folks out there like that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll automatically agree, but at least I can have a conversation with them. But it's probably the, I don't want to say the old school, but there's still a fragment of the old school that I probably don't talk to too much. But I think about David Horrell. I can have conversations with David Horrell and think about what white biblical interpretation has done and what it means to be Black biblical interpreter and dialogue with his own readings of Paul. I can read Sean Kelly and have conversations with Sean Kelly and think about, Jesus in parable studies. But I think it's those folks who I just don't even, I just can't waste my time with those. So that's where I'm at. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Stacy or Kenneth, do you want to weigh in here at all? No pressure, just check in before we wrap things up.
Well, yes, I mean, I do have hope. I do have hope that there's a possibility for conversations. Like Angela says, I mean, there are some people who are curious about and interested in learning these new theories and methods, and I think it's important to find those partners and to be in conversation, because Black biblical studies is not insular. It is not defined by turning inward. That's not what defines it. In fact, it is its capacity to be expansive that makes it what it is. And for some people, that is too much to handle. And so they back away. But I do think that because of its expansiveness, its readiness to move the meaning line, to push it, that makes it possible for us to create a better future. So there is hope. Hope not in the sense that we're wishing that they would, but hope in the sense that Africana or Black biblical studies is making an intervention, and that intervention will produce something. That's what I understand by hope. Like, that's the active part of it.
And just to say briefly, I mean, I have found feminist scholars, regardless of gender, to be some of the best conversation partners I've had, regardless of gender or ethnicity, because you can have serious conversations about work. But the flip side is there is a senior Bible scholar whose work I will not use, because let's just say that he called me out in a meeting when I was the only person of color there, and I hold a grudge. I'm not going to lie. And so I don't use his work. I work around him because I'm thinking, I see you. And so I don't trust at this point the quality of your scholarship, because you've actually showed me yourself as a human being, and I don't trust you. So I will actively choose not to use people's work if they show their backside, and I'm not sorry for that. So when Professor Angela said certain people you don't engage with, I don't engage with that person, and I'm not sorry about it.
Okay, before I'm gonna ask by way of conclusion in a couple seconds for Vincent just to offer some just any information about upcoming opportunities or events through Africana Studies. But I first just want to really extend profound gratitude to our three panelists for taking the time to share your scholarship and your broader approaches and perspective with all of us. I've learned a tremendous amount just in the past hour and 15 minutes, and I know I speak for everyone who's here in saying that. This session, as you all know, was just recorded, and hopefully Vincent will have some information on where the link can be found. So for all of you who might know of friends or colleagues who perhaps wanted to attend this event but weren't able because of timing, please feel encouraged to pass the recording on to them, to share this this really wonderful learning beyond the confines of just those who are able to make it here live at this time. So again, Kenneth, Stacy, and Angela, thank you so much. Looking forward to hopefully being an ongoing conversation both with you and your work. So Vincent, please.
Wow, what a wonderful conversation. Thanks again to all the panelists and to my new colleague, Dr. Ethan Schwartz, for organizing the discussion. And on behalf of Villanova's Africana Studies program, we're very proud to have hosted this discussion. As Ethan mentioned, the event was recorded. It will be on Villanova's YouTube channel. We'll also share links to that on our social media accounts at Nova Africana. And you can check out past events. We did a What is Critical Race Theory event that's gotten quite a bit of viewership on YouTube that we did a couple of months ago as well. We do have another event coming up at the end of next week on April 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern. If you want to move forward in time a couple centuries, looking at racism in late antiquity and the early or in the origins of Christianity. Is Christianity the source of racism, with Denise Buell and Terrence Keel, a couple of faculty members, and then a couple of responses. That's April 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern. If you're a Villanova community member thinking about fall courses, registration is opening today. We're offering Swahili for the first time. We encourage you to think about that Swahili course as well. And on our social media accounts and on our webpage, you can find all of the fall Africana Studies courses. But I don't want to keep folks any longer. Thank you again so much to the panelists, to the audience members, and to Professor Schwartz for organizing this fantastic event. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Everyone, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Pleasure, friends.